Hey, thank you, Katie. Actually, that trip's a real good segue into this because as an 8-year-old, I could see the difference when you would go from culture to culture in the 60s between like Thailand and Cambodia, India, and the US, predominantly was in the standard of living. And the difference came about because of technology. For example, in Thailand, they were paving a road that we were riding on, and they would carry the pavement in baskets on their head, plop it down on the ground, and they would pat it with their feet to pave it. So that took forever to build a road. And so that really struck me. And of course, as when I was younger, we'd watch Star Trek and we'd think about the future. And we'd always think of the future as being a future of more things, more technological advancement. And it has been. But there's one thing that's been bothering me, bothering a lot of people. A lot of people may not know how to articulate it, but it's in the minds of, I think, most people in America today. And it's the simple question, which is, if technology is so powerful and it is essentially a labor-saving device that allows us to produce more with less effort, shouldn't the cost of a home be a smaller percentage of your salary? Shouldn't it be cheaper to buy a car? Shouldn't healthcare be less? And why is it not? Or is it not? And so I'll give you some examples. If you talk to an economist, they'll say wages have roughly kept up with inflation. So that means we shouldn't be falling behind. But inflation is determined by the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and it ignores some things. It ignores the cost of a house, cars, things like that. So there's two little pieces of data. The cost of housing, of health insurance, of food, now cars, and education. All of those are going up much faster than the CPI and wages. So a college graduate in 1950, if he got a starter job, his first job out of college, he could expect the cost of health insurance to be 1.5% his salary. So today, same college graduate out of college, his starter job, health insurance takes 39% of his salary. You can see the problem. It goes from 1.5 to 39. And if you plot it out over the decades, it's pretty much a straight line. It's been continually changing in that direction. It's not a recent, sudden, horrible thing. So if you look at cost of housing, the way you should look at it is say, well, let's take that recent college graduate's income and we'll subtract out, we'll pick the same things: health insurance, food, and 1/10 of the cost of the car. So he's going to keep his car for 10 years, right? If you do that in 1950, the leftover salary, a house was 2.2 times the cost of that leftover salary. So in other words, 2.5 years saving up, he could buy a house. Right? Today, you do the same thing: college graduate, early job, minus health insurance, minus food, and minus 1/10 of a car. A house now costs 25 times that salary. So from 1950 to 2025, it went from 2.2 times to 25 times. And that's the same for all those core expenses. And that is why people feel like they're falling behind, because they are. And that is the case for housing, for example. the 98th percentile, so the top 2% in our nation, their wages and income are growing faster than the cost of a house. But for 98% of us, it's not. And that's the challenge. So that became my big question. And I noticed something in C.S. Lewis that ties into this Nehemiah passage that Sherry read. C.S. Lewis, in his book called Mere Christianity, he said he wanted to show that the scriptures were relevant today. Every scripture was relevant. That was his proposal. And he went through all of them and he punted on one. He punted on interest. In the book of Nehemiah, when they talk about interest, he punted on that. And he said, I'm not an economist, so I don't know if the mess we have, and so he's talking about the mess we had in 1945. Okay, so these ratios we're talking about are way off of what he's seeing in 1945. He's saying, I don't know if it's because we're ignoring the very thing that our elders, and in fact, all 5 world religions have said, which is you can't charge interest. And they meant it in a different way, making money just off of money. And so today, I'll give you another little factoid. We have a monetary economy and we have the material economy. The material economy is the production of goods and services in the distribution and consumption of them. It's like how we experience life, right? We're producing all this stuff, we're consuming it. If you size that, it's $32 billion. That's our GDP. But today, if you size the monetary economy, it's $7,100 trillion. 32 versus 7,100. That's making money off of money. So if what Nehemiah said and notice, Nehemiah said, he said, I and my brothers and men are also lending the people money and grain. What Nehemiah was observing was like all of us kind of in the somewhat upper echelon are doing this. And so the financial freedom plan, the work I've been working on over years is, how do you change that around? How do you change that? And the truth is you can change it dramatically. First of all, just on interest. We have a Federal Reserve today. It can produce money. They call it generate a reserve. They do this. If you remember during the pandemic, they generated trillions of dollars of money and they bought treasury bonds and they bought mortgage-backed securities. The Fed did that because they were trying to bolster the economy. Well, what was the net effect of that? In 2 years during the pandemic, just those 2 years of the pandemic, in those 2 years, millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of small businesses were shut down. The economy was not doing well during those 2 years, and yet the stock market boomed. It just took off. And the 10 wealthiest men in the world doubled their net worth in those 2 years. So they'd spent their whole lives building that net worth, and in the next 2 years, they doubled it. And that was all through the monetary economy. So it's the monetary economy that's really running that show. And so if we, at the Fed, if we switched over to what I would call a reserve-based banking system, where you generate the reserves, instead of a depository-based banking system, where we lend the depositors money out. So you have to pay interest to get the money, and then you lend it out at interest. A reserve-based one is you generate a reserve, it's at no cost. The Fed generates the reserve at no cost. It's a flippant software. and you lend that out at no interest, our mortgage payments would cut in half right then. In other words, we'd be using financial technology to reduce the cost of buying a home. We'd cut it in half. We can do that. And I have actually talked to a Fed president who lives near us. And he said entirely feasible, and we should be doing this. So it's, I mean, it's not outrageous. We could do that. Now you would change things because you wouldn't want home prices to double overnight, would you? If it costs you half as much to buy a home and people are used to spending a certain amount, they'll go ahead and they'd be willing to spend it for twice the home. But you can change that. You change the underwriting parameter. So instead of a third of your income, you're only allowed to spend a sixth when you qualify for a loan. Same home, half the price. That's what you want. There's a whole slew of these things that I outline in that book. And the bottom line is, all I'm saying is, if we look at money the way Christ looked at the Sabbath. Now that seems funny at first, right? What did Christ say about the Sabbath? He said the Sabbath was made for man. It was made for the benefit of man. It was a gift to man, not man for the Sabbath. The rabbis back then were saying, you got to do this, you have to do this. They suddenly turned the Sabbath into an ordeal because of all their rules and the way they administered it. But if you look at the history of the Sabbath, it was like, guys, I got him behind you, and you can take a break once a week. And you can rest, as I rested in Genesis. That's a radical notion several thousand years ago when you're working 24/7, So you can rest. I say the same thing about money. Money was made for man, for the benefit of man, not man for money. And yet, if we look about us and we look within our own lives, how often have we been on a hamster wheel, on a rat race for the almighty dollar? Isn't our nation in a rat race for the almighty dollar? We have this debt going out that we've been at $1 trillion. It's outrageous. But we invented money. And so in the financial freedom plan, I show very clear steps that we could actually change that around. If we tax that 7,000 trillion instead of our 27 trillion in income, you have the tiniest little tax, and we wouldn't have taxes anymore. We wouldn't pay interest anymore. You could literally collect enough at a 0.5% fee that you could provide basic income, free healthcare, and free college for every citizen in the United States. You could do that at 0.5%. So at a 0.5% tax rate on the whole flow of money and no interest on your banks, your life's change overnight. And it's not a hard thing to do. It's not that difficult. And I've now, in the last years, met with lots of people in the financial community. And now one has said why it won't work. They've all said, wow, we should do this. So that's the message, is that today there are two sets of laws. There's the natural laws, and the material economy runs on that. The supply of water, how hard is it to smelt gold? What does it take to build an airplane, right? And that's technology. We've gotten really good at obeying God's laws. Man's laws are the monetary economy. Where does money come from? What do you pay for it? Who's it? We created those laws. We just need to move them in sync. It's so ironic that today our engineers obey God's laws. And it's the monetary economy that's throwing us off. It's no more complicated than that. That's the whole. I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Scott. Do we have any questions or comments in the room? I think Jimmy does. Let me give the mic to Jimmy. Just one moment.
Thank you for that. I really enjoyed that, especially the part about buying houses. My question is, and how do we as working people bring those rates down to make life affordable for everybody who wants a house to buy a house?
It would require an act of Congress. That's the challenge. So the Financial Freedom Plan is basically a proposal for an act of Congress. And so as an individual, you can't go to the bank and change any of that. It's who we're going to elect, and it's getting the word out. So that is my next phase in life. Is it took me many years to write this book, refine it, rethink it. AI has been really useful in being able to dig into the numbers better. But the next phase of life is just speaking on videos, boosting those posts, and I'm trying to develop a groundswell of support. So people are saying, wait, is this guy crazy? This could actually be done. It just has to get into mainstream media where enough people are talking about it. And there's a whole plan that I have behind that. And it's gathered steam, and I have quite a few supporters now on it. So it's getting the word out. It's getting the word out. Ultimately, it might be actually drafting the bill. And I have a law firm in Washington who has agreed to do that. And they find it very exciting. So you can actually say, it's this bill. That's all they have to do is vote on that one. Download the PDF for yourself. So it's an act of Congress, which is
Thank
no
you so
small
much,
thing,
Scott.
Jimmy. It's no small thing.
Thank you
Scott,
so much, Scott. Jimmy says thank you too.
Thank you, Jimmy.
I read your book when it first came out. I think we're talking about the same book. It was a couple years ago, right?
The book has changed. It's been updated,
Oh, okay.
but it's the same principle. If you read the first one, you have the basics.
Okay, so one of the basics, as I recall it, was that you would put a small tax on every
The
financial
flow of money.
I'm sorry?
The flow of money is what we call it. So that
Okay.
includes, yeah. So that's like anytime, like say, a PE fund is formed. You read about BlackRock put together a $10 trillion fund to invest in Southeast Asia. Well, $10 trillion moved into BlackRock's coffers. 0.5% shaved off of that. No one made any money on that yet. It's just money flowing. Like if your Uncle Fred sends you a check for $100,000, here nephew, here's a check, 0.5% comes off. It was a gift, but no 0.5%. So if we taxed 0.5% all the time, no matter what, then it would provide sufficient revenue to pay off the national debt, get our basic income, balance the budget.
So did your talk imply that the major opposition would come from the people who have profited big time from the current system?
Well, you would think so, but I have met a lot of the ultra high net worth people, and they actually think this would be a fantastic idea. I met with one of the families that you always hear about. There's like 10 families out there that own 40% of the assets. And I met with one of those families, and he said he'd read the book and he liked it. And he said, I have 2 questions for you. He asked me to come to his office in New York, and I did. And it was like a 10-minute meeting. He said, first question is, who do you think will bear the brunt of this flow tax? I should have just said you. I said the families that own the assets that when they're traded create the flow, the 7,000 trillion. And he goes, that would be right. So we were in agreement. And his second question is, what do you think the impact would be on those families? That was the big question, right? And I said, well, the fact that the monetary economy, the value in the monetary economy, if you total all the financial assets up, is 250 times greater than the value in the material economy. I said, there's some sort of multiplying effect going on there, you know? And I'd say for every trillion that came into the flow tax and went into the material economy, it ought to produce a couple hundred trillion of additional assets. So the people who own those assets, even though they're paying that tax, the value of the assets would go up proportionately so that they would actually do better with a flow tax. I mean, I just threw the cards on the table, right? I don't know what he'd say. And he said, we'd see it that way too. He used the word we, like he talked to others. He said, we'd see it that way too. And he says, I think it would be a growing recursive thing. I think it's a great idea and you should do it. That was one of the most interesting meetings I ever had in my life.
Can I ask if this person was a left-leaning or right-leaning person?
I don't know. He gave me his cell number and I can text him today. And we text. Yeah. I think he's right. I think he leans to the right. He's not like you know, some of the multi-billionaires who were more left, you know.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, sir. I've attended meetings here in DC where representatives of the banks tell people, consumers and businesses, that they can get them loans. They have programs, they have special packages, they have special financing and so forth, and they can get them the loans they need for the properties, the mortgages they want. Now, do you think they are, but yet I go into some of the banks and they don't seem to be a big rush on some of their employees there. So do you think they are not marketing these programs properly, or do you think that perhaps people may not understand the claims that they're making?
So that's a really good observation. And so since the Great Depression, our nation has been very careful about trying to keep the banking system safe because of the disaster we saw in the 30s when there were bank runs and the banks lost their deposits. And so the banking system has been reined in. It's a lot of red tape. It's become much more conservative. And after 2008, even more so, because the government doesn't want the bank to risk the depositor's money. And that's the beauty of what I call banking 2.0. If you're using reserves to lend, you're not risking the depositor's money. The depositors aren't going to make any interest on their deposits anymore. That's one of the downsides of banking 2.0. But banks would actually be able to make loans for a startup, for small businesses. Right now, we have systems set in place where if you're a small business, you can go to a bank, but you're going to get a small business administration loan guaranteed by the government. And that's very costly. And so banks, since 2008, banks have been very tight because of the regulatory environment that they are in. So an aspect of this that banks would like is that they would be able to make a wider range of loans and they could do it interest-free. The negative to them is they don't make as much on the loans because they're not going to be able to charge the interest. But in the book, I also point out that our nation's banks could become the international financiers because we could generate those reserves and lend them overseas, and you could charge interest on that. And in Nehemiah, that's the very same thing they did. When they don't, it's not in this part of Nehemiah, but he said, we can charge interest to other nations, but not too high. So it's the parallels between this and Nehemiah are kind of spooky, but the main challenge with getting financing at banks today is it's very tight parameters and very limited in what they can do. And the very reason we have a private equity industry is because banks don't fill that void. The very reason we have venture capital in Silicon Valley is because banks don't fill that void. And so it's a really interesting aspect that we've hamstrung ourselves in a certain sense. Now, you still, if the Fed's generated the reserve, you still don't want to write bad loans. But if you do write a loan and it goes bad, the consequences are much less because you're not losing the depositor's money. You've lost some money that a Fed generated reserve and released. And so you've kind of inflated the monetary supply a little, but that's not as bad as losing a customer's money. So it's a whole different system. It's radically different.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think I also saw Malcolm's hand.
Yeah, I just wonder, Scott, whether it's the very boldness of your plan that may present an obstacle to its acceptance.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. It's bold, but it's sort of like, could there be an incremental approach? I suppose. But it's also the boldness that could get people, excited and rallying. And I think Sherry and I've been watching a documentary on Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Depression and when he ran for presidency and what was going on in our country. And it was shocking to see how deep the devastation was back then. But I think that we are approaching a similar time in history in which both parties are failing to provide us anything even remotely resembling a solution. And so at some point in time, what does it have to go from? Housing has to go from 2 times your disposable income to 25 to 50 before we act. When does it happen? And you see, BlackRock, a big PE fund, has gone out and bought $1 trillion of residential real estate. They're filling that gap. But that means people aren't going to be buying, they're going to be renting from BlackRock.
I think Joy also put something in the chat. Let me see. Joy says interest rates were very low after 2008. How might credit unions work?
So credit unions could do this. They could work with the Federal Reserve on this too. They could be in the same boat. In fact, what would happen, the way I present it in the book, is there'd be specialty banks. There'd be banks. You would no longer have to have deposits to be a bank. You would say, I want to be a venture capital lender, and you'd go through the training, there'd be regulations. It's not free for all. You'd go through that process and then you'd be qualified to actually put that money out at a different equity rate. So credit unions could easily fill that void. And credit unions are interesting because they have been able to do a little bit of a wider range of loans than normal banks do. The irony is today's banks, if you look at, here's what a bank can do, and you have A through Z, you go back centuries back, and you look at what banks did A through Z, today's banks do L through N. They're not allowed to do A through K anymore. In our modern technology, our banks are hobbled. They're not able to do what they used to do. That's a great irony to me.
Thank you, Scott. I also think I saw Katarina's hand.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation, Scott. I have 2 quick questions. How would your plan just affect US dollar-based monetary transfers? And if so, how do you think it would impact de-dollarization and the trend we are seeing there?
So, okay, that's a really good question. It would impact any sort of transfers in financial assets. So it would include crypto. You want to create a situation where everybody just moves to crypto. And what it does is the reason sort of this de-dollarization, the whole thing, there's a lot of international pressure. China doesn't like the fact that most things are dollar denominated when you're buying oil and things like that. So there's always been international pressure against the dollar. But there's been this internal view, even especially on the right, where, well, the dollar's going down the tubes. We need to come up with something else. This puts the dollar back being square strong, and it would make the dollar the global reserve currency. And so if we do that right and we run our nation right and we're fair about it, it would be a huge benefit to the international community. And for example, one of the guys in the Fed that I talked to is very concerned about what's happening because he's Black, and he's very concerned about what's happening in Africa with his brothers back there, as he puts it. He said, because China's coming in. And he described it just as rape and pillage. They come in, they say, oh, you need a new soccer station. We'll build a soccer stadium for you, but we want all these natural resources you have. And then he goes, and then top it off, you have to hire Chinese labor to build the stadium, and you pay back to China. And so all the money that they put in your country comes right back into China, and now they own all your resources. And he said, if the Fed could just, through member banks, step in there and finance other nations, this would allow us to do it. Right today, with depository-based banking, you're really limited in being able to lend money into foreign countries. But under this, you wouldn't. You'd actually be able to become the international financiers. And that is where the US banks could actually make money on doing that. As long as we're fair on the rates, we could benefit off of being able to capitalize the rest of the world. We're uniquely in that position as a nation, and eventually we'll lose that. We won't be uniquely in that position.
Scott, what regulations do you see as necessary in this system? Because one of the things that concerns me is we've seen a drastic stripping of regulatory power on the part of the Fed and the part of the federal government.
Yeah, this is the irony. Yeah, that's a really good question. It's very complex. It's when you have depository-based banking, you have a group that has garnered capital and then has the right to do certain things. And so they're always pushing for deregulation. They want to do more things. And yet, as we've seen, repealing Glass-Steagall, which was implemented during the Great Depression, which said, hey, banks can't go take your money and gamble on Wall Street with them, So when we repealed it, the banks are saying, we want to be able to invest that money on Wall Street, But it's like deregulation has been a big part of the right for some time. And it's a double-edged sword. You can look at where a highly regulated environment can also hold back innovation and can also interfere with free market plays. That's true. But then at the same time, as I've had a friend, when they were discussing this whole deregulation, he just retired out of Goldman Sachs, and he said, I'll deny it if you ever tell anyone I said this, because he was always voted Republican. He said, but as well as I do that the guys on Wall Street will stop at nothing. Unless they're regulated, it's a free-for-all. And so when one party owns that money or has control of that money, then they can operate on greed, and it's always destructive for the rest of society. So whether you're a PE fund and you raise the money from state pension funds, so it's state workers' backs, it's their money, but now you have it. and you're putting it out there and you're operating as a PE fund, greed can easily become your mode of operation. And so you'll always find financial institutions pushing for deregulation because greed runs them. But under Banking 2.0, if it's the Fed is owned by the people, and it's our bank, and it's our money, it's our country, it's our dollar, then that money can be put out under a different mode. And so if it's interest-free lending for a mortgage, you're not going to get the greed that ran 2008. You're saying you're going to make a 1% origination fee, you're going to get your quarter point on servicing. If you're going to step in, I actually have like a little table in Banking 2.0. If you decide you want to become a venture capitalist, then today, like when Google went public, the guys who founded it were lucky to own 15% of it. The people who owned the other 85% were the people who put the money up, because we have this time value sense of money. But you could finance a company like Google through Banking 2.0 and let the owners actually have 50%, let the intermediary who oversees it, the member bank, get 10, and the 40% could go back to the American public through the Fed as Fed dividends. There are ways to do this. My whole point of this is a system always functions as the system is designed to do. But today's system is designed to reward greed. It's designed to make it a net zero sum game. It has all these different ingredients in it. And our society's economics today reflect the outcome of the system. Tiny little systemic changes, and you're going to have a system that does something different. And I'm not saying that any of this is perfect, but you can clearly see how a change from today's system could create a huge amount of benefit for the American citizens. I feel like part and parcel of this change, there has to be a change in the spiritual thinking of humans, very much so. But I feel like that's always happened, because I feel like 500 years ago, it was way different. Children weren't raised in the environment that we raised. It's just like, you think about all this, you really wouldn't want to live 500 years ago. So I feel like technology is always pushing the boundary, and mankind has to mature when the technology comes. So we're finally at the stage where financial technology can be envisioned that would push us into a new boundary where we're saying, wait a minute, money was made for man, not man for money. How do we actually take advantage of our ability to produce more and actually have a higher standard of living? Maybe not have to work as much, And, it's a really interesting question. It's hard to say in a 30-minute discussion all the nuances that have come out in the book, especially as I've studied through AI, looking at the intermediaries that grow within an economy that siphon off that productive value. But we have an enormous opportunity with the technology we have. And it is our financial operating system that holds us back today. That's all. That's the bottom line. That's the part that is exciting.
Scott, thank you so much. And I'm cognizant of the time, but I think, Rich, did you have a quick question? It could be our last one.
Sure, just one quick observation. That the numbers that you spoke about at the beginning about what it is for a young person today financially, if those numbers continue, you can see the trend is going to create a revolution.
Right.
And particularly as college-educated young people who have been promised a certain path, and you add AI into the mix, they're going to be mad, and they're going to turn to some sort of radical movement to change things, and very likely a demagogue from the left or the right. And we're kind of in the throes of that now. So it does strike me that your bold plan is it's a very spiritual alternative to what I think could be a very dangerous moment. So I just wanted to thank you for all the work you're doing on it.
I agree. In that first chapter, I say we are this close to the French Revolution.
Yeah.
And there are solutions, but we don't apply solutions. We will have to have the French Revolution.
Well, maybe with God's spirit and God's guidance, things can happen that we couldn't really anticipate.
Right. I hope so.
Thanks for your work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Scott, before we close, I just want to say thank you so much. I really loved your presentation. While you were speaking, there were a lot of wows and amens in the room, so we really appreciate it. As a young person, it feels impossible to buy a house, so I feel very thankful for your scholarship and your hard work. So thank you so much for all that you do.